Costa Rica is one of the Latin American countries with the highest GDPs per capita and one of the most stable and consolidated democracies in the region, despite starting out as one of the poorest and most isolated. To see how this surprising turn of events developed, join me for a brief explainer on Costa Rican history and politics. The Spanish first stumbled upon Costa Rican territory when on his fourth voyage in 1502, Christopher Columbus dropped anchor in Uvita Island off the coast of present-day Puerto Limon. He thought the area showed promise as he named it Rich Coast, but it still would take the Europeans over 2 decades to establish any kind of permanent settlement, and the one they finally established in 1524, Villa de Bruselas, would survive barely 5 years as conflict between competing authorities led to its abandonment, a pattern that would find echoes in the immediate years after independence. It was not until the 1560s that a Spanish colony was firmly established in Costa Rica. Hoping to cultivate the rich volcanic soil of the Central Valley, the Spanish founded the village of Cartago on the banks of the Rio Reventazón. Although the fledgling colony was extremely isolated, it miraculously survived under the leadership of its first governor, Juan Vásquez de Coronado. Some of Costa Rica's demilitarized presence was presaged in its early colonial government. Preferring diplomacy over firearms to counter the indigenous threat, Coronado used Cartago as a base to survey the land south to Panama and west to the Pacific, and secured deed and title over the colony. During most of the colonial period, Costa Rica was the southernmost province of the Captaincy General of Guatemala, which itself was nominally part of the Viceroyalty of New Spain. Given its distance from the capital of Guatemala, however, in practice it operated as a largely autonomous entity within the Spanish Empire. At the same time, the legal prohibition under Spanish law against trading with its southern neighbors in Panama, then part of the Viceroyalty of New Granada, and the lack of resources such as gold and silver resulted in Costa Rica attracting few inhabitants. As late as 1675, there were only 500 to 700 Spanish settlers in Costa Rica, and by 1720, the number barely exceeded 3,000. The indigenous population was similarly low, although it's possible that as many as 400,000 natives lived in what was to become Costa Rica. By the end of the 16th century, there were fewer than 20,000, and according to some estimates, as few as 4,500 by 1581. The total population of Costa Rica, meanwhile, was estimated at less than 25,000 in 1778, of which only 8% was indigenous. It wasn't until the mid-1850s that the total population of the country had grown to more than 100,000. Thus, throughout the entire colonial period, Costa Rica was poor, isolated, and sparsely inhabited. A Spanish governor in 1719 described it as the poorest and most miserable Spanish colony in all America. The small population, both indigenous and immigrant, together with the absence of major gold and silver mines, meant that agriculture became the principal source of economic activity throughout the colonial period. Although the soil was rich in many parts of the country and a wide variety of crops grew well, farming was directed toward subsistence agriculture. As a result, Costa Rica had little to trade in exchange for needed goods that were not available locally. The initial poverty reinforced itself by placing beyond the reach of the settlers the farm tools and other implements needed for a more productive economy. Throughout the colonial period, efforts were made to add vitality to the fragile local economy. Attention was focused on export agriculture, especially cacao and tobacco. Both crops grew well and fetched high prices on the international market, but both eventually failed in Costa Rica. In the case of cacao, which was grown in the tropical lowlands bordering on the Caribbean Sea, marauding natives from Nicaragua, in league with British pirates, systematically raided the plantations and stole the crop as it was being prepared for export. Tobacco grew in the highlands and therefore was protected against such coastal raids, but Spain declared a monopoly on tobacco exports and drove down profit margins for producers to the point where the cultivation of tobacco no longer proved worth the effort. By the end of the colonial period, Costa Rica had not been able to find a way out of its poverty. Isolation, mountains, volcanoes, earthquakes, and the absence of a sizable indigenous workforce do not seem to add up to a very promising basis for the impressive developments that Costa Rica was eventually to achieve. Paradoxically, however, what seemed like disadvantages turned out to be significant advantages. Isolation proved a blessing because it removed the country from the civil wars and violence that so rapidly came to characterize post-independent Central America. Later, the dictatorial rule and foreign invasions that plagued the rest of the region had little direct impact on Costa Rica. Furthermore, in contrast to its neighbors to both the north and the south, Nicaragua and Panama, Costa Rica's relative political stability meant that it was never subject to an invasion by U.S. Marines. The mountains provided the altitude and the volcanoes the rich soil for what was to prove to be a highly successful coffee industry. Finally, the absence of a large indigenous population meant that the repressive labor systems, especially the encomienda system that predominated in much of the rest of Latin America, could not prosper in Costa Rica. Napoleon's invasion of Spain in 1808 shook most of Spanish America, but not Costa Rica. Instead, the future country gained independence as part of the Kingdom of Guatemala when the Guatemalan elites proclaimed independence on September 15, 1821, in a completely bloodless process unopposed by Spanish authorities. Only a few days later, Mexico also finalized its independence and set up an empire under the authority of Agustín de Iturbide, a former general in the Spanish army. Iturbide immediately set to annex Central America to his regime, and while Central America as a region, including Costa Rica, agreed to it, it was not completely unopposed. In the Costa Rican case, there was a division between the towns of Cartago and Heredia on one side and San José de Alajuela on the other, conflict which eventually led to a brief bout of violence, what the Costa Ricans know as the War of Ochomogo. Although the Tico Republicans, under the leadership of Gregorio José Ramírez, ended up winning, the whole thing ended up being moot as Emperor Iturbide was deposed in 1823 and Central America declined membership in Mexico's newly established republic. Subsequently, Costa Rica joined its neighbors in the creation of a federation, the Federal Republic of Central America. Juan Mora Fernández, the nation's first head of state, equivalent to a governor under the federation, set out to build his nation. He organized new towns, built roads, and published a newspaper. His wife even partook in the effort by designing the country's first flag. In 1824, the Nicoya-Guanacaste region seceded from Nicaragua and joined its more easygoing southern neighbor, defining the territorial borders. Still, although Costa Rica enjoyed some stability, the same could not be said about the Federation, which soon fell victim to arguments over centralism or federalism and would not survive long. Costa Ricans were not entirely immune to those debates. In their case, they not only disagreed with themselves about the power that Guatemala City should have, but they couldn't even decide whether their capital should be Cartago or San Jose, as both vied to be the political center of the country. There was an attempt to resolve the dispute by having the capital shift every 4 years, but in the end, a political leader in San Jose, Braulio Carrillo, was able to impose that city as the capital and himself as a ruler for life. Carrillo was also able to permanently sever Costa Rica's ties to the Central American Republic in the late 1830s, and thus he's celebrated today as the father of the Costa Rican Republic. One way the now President for life began to consolidate Costa Rica's independence was by granting land to farmers who were willing to plant coffee on it, and to create roads that would connect the interior highlands with the Atlantic coast. As a result, coffee cultivation increased dramatically in the first half of the 19th century, and by the 1840s, direct exports of Costa Rican coffee to the markets in Europe had begun. The product was well received by buyers and quickly achieved a reputation for its high quality, one that still holds today. Carrillo himself was removed by force when Francisco Morazán, a former president of the Central American Republic, invaded the country in 1842. Fearful that Morazán would try to put the federation back together, however, an insurrection against him broke out in Alajuela and soon spread throughout all of Costa Rica. Morazán was deposed and executed on September 11th of that year, the dream of a Central American Union more or less dying with him. But while Carrillo himself did not remain in power, especially because Morazán's rule did not last long enough to leave much of a legacy in the country, Carrillo's coffee economic model would long outlive him. For the rest of the 19th century, coffee would become the principal engine of economic growth for the country. The income from these exports made it possible for the Costa Rican government to be able to invest funds in critical infrastructure projects. especially roads and ports, to facilitate the production and export of coffee. The largest and most consequential project that grew out of the effort to facilitate coffee exports was the construction of a railroad to the Caribbean port of Limon, a replacement of the road Carrillo first began. Until the completion of this project in 1890, virtually all coffee exports had been shipped to Europe via the Pacific coast of Punta Arenas, around the tip of South America, and then to Europe. Early on in this process, the coffee was repackaged in Chile and shipped to Europe. The railroad project to the Caribbean therefore promised to cut costs while ensuring the establishment of brand recognition for Costa Rican coffee. Unlike other Central American countries where tenant farmers and indigenous peoples were displaced from their communal lands and forced into debt peonage, most Costa Ricans benefited from coffee. Some landowners, after consolidating their holdings, became the exporting elite. Yet, small growers remained numerous, even in the 1990s, when there were 65,000 to 100,000 coffee-producing farms. Costa Rica's more inclusive economy expedited democratic reforms and welcomed the enlightened leadership of General Tomás Guardia. Although a military dictator himself, from 1870 to 1882, General Guardia convinced the wealthy coffee growers that coups d'état were bad for business and gained their support for placing the military under civilian controls. He promulgated the law of universal education to develop a trained labor force and implemented a far-ranging system of public education. In addition, he instituted the law of individual rights and eliminated capital punishment. By the end of the 19th century, Costa Rica was still not free of dictators, yet it had distinguished itself from other Central American nations by checking the power of the military and conducting peaceful elections between conservative and liberal candidates. By 1889, an economic slowdown and the liberals' anti-clericalism generated support for an opposition Catholic Union Party and its presidential candidate, José J. Rodríguez. Backed by the Catholic Church, Rodríguez won the vote among the electors, but the army tried to block him from taking office. Incited by the church, angry citizens took to the streets and forced the army to back down. Often incorrectly cited as the birth of Costa Rican democracy, this election nevertheless forced the military to respect an opposition party and mobilized ordinary citizens to defend an election. After Rodríguez, however, authoritarian elite rulers and election fraud returned. From 1905 to 1914, Presidents Cleto González Viquez and Ricardo Jiménez Oriamuno further broadened suffrage, established direct popular election of public officials, and permitted free and open opposition campaigns. This pattern of democratization was interrupted when the Tinoco brothers carried out a coup in 1917 during the recession of World War I. Their regime immediately faced an insurrection, however, and despite their attempts at legitimization, the regime was soon toppled. It ended when Federico, the older brother and president, went into exile a few days after the murder of his brother. It was to be Costa Rica's last military government. Civilian constitutional rule continued thereafter, and the Costa Rican electorate expanded continuously. The Atlantic Railroad's completion led to an additional export crop, bananas. The foreign-owned banana industry concentrated in the sparsely populated Atlantic coastal lowlands, and thus had little effect on Costa Rican politics in the early 20th century. As hard times developed later, labor organizers led by communists organized the banana plantations. Union influence and political power grew. By the 1940s, the Great Depression and World War II had caused severe social dislocations. This pitted against one another factions representing variously the political economic elite, the working classes and unions, and an emerging middle class. In the early 1940s, President Rafael Calderón Guardia, a medical doctor and reformist coffee aristocrat, broke with the rest of the coffee-growing political class. Bidding to dominate the government, he allied with the communist unions and the Catholic Church. Assisted by communist legislators, Calderón enacted and began implementing Costa Rica's first labor and social security laws. Calderón's alliance with the communists, and in 1948, electoral fraud and legislative tampering with the presidential election results provided pretext for a brief but violent civil war. A coalition between elite politicos angry at Calderón, and middle-class elements dominated by a junta of social democrats led by José Pepe Figueres Ferrer rebelled. The rebels defeated the government within just a few months. From that time to the 1990s, the country's Social Democrats, the National Liberation Party, or PLN, led for 3 decades by Figueres, set the tone of Costa Rican political life. In keeping with a well-established tradition of political accommodation, the victorious National Liberation Junta retained Calderón's social reforms for workers. The junta went even further by nationalizing the banking and insurance industries. A constituent assembly rewrote the Constitution in 1949, enfranchising women and blacks and abolishing the army. The latter act ensured future political stability. In late 1949, the junta turned the presidency over to the rightful winner of the 1948 election, Otilio Ulate, who was not a part of the National Liberation Movement. When the PLN and Figueres first won the presidency in 1954, they expanded the social legislation initiated under Calderón. Increasing segments of the populace received health and social security coverage. Even the conservative coalition governments that periodically replaced the PLN in power preserved and expanded these social benefits. After 1949, successive governments held regular and scrupulously honest elections administered by the powerful and independent Supreme Electoral Tribunal. When defeated at the polls, the PLN willingly relinquished government control. Between 1949 and 2010, the PLN won the presidency 9 times and the opposition 7. Opinion surveys showed strong citizen support for democratic civil liberties and alternation in power by the competing parties. In sum, Costa Rica's center-left social democratic PLN governments took power and consolidated a new political and economic regime in the 1940s and 1950s despite countervailing trends elsewhere in the Isthmus. Similar post-World War II movements favoring democracy appeared in Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, and El Salvador, but all failed. Instrumental in this failure of pro-democracy mobilization elsewhere were U.S. anti-communist policies that aided and encouraged national armed forces and rightist elites to block the left's struggle for reform. In contrast, in Costa Rica, the pro-democracy reformers had defeated the communists in the 1948 Civil War and thereafter contained their influence. This put Costa Rica's new regime on the good side of the United States and helped it survive where others nearby would not. Meanwhile, U.S. intervention in Nicaragua in the 1970s and 1980s polarized Costa Rica. From conservative quarters came a loud call to reestablish the military and join the anti-communist crusade. In May 1984, more than 20,000 demonstrators marched through San Jose to give peace a chance, though the debate didn't climax until the 1986 presidential election. The victor was 44-year-old Oscar Arias Sánchez, who despite being born into coffee wealth, was an intellectual reformer in the mold of José Figueres Ferrer, his political patron. Once in office, Arias affirmed his commitment to a negotiated resolution and reasserted Costa Rican national independence. He vowed to uphold his country's pledge of neutrality and to vanquish the Contras from the territory, a stance that led to the abrupt resignation of the U.S. ambassador. Most notably, Arias became the driving force in uniting Central America around a peace plan, which ended the Nicaraguan War and earned him the Nobel Peace Prize in 1987. Costa Rica's politics have begun to shift in recent years. New political parties, often forming coalitions with other minor parties, have entered the electoral arena in force, which in turn have weakened the PLN's grip on the presidency. Thus, they have been unable to win the presidency since 2010, when Laura Chinchilla Miranda, Costa Rica's first female president, was elected. Meanwhile, one of the most serious problems to confront Costa Rica in recent memory is the growing number of high-level incidents of corruption. 2 former presidents, Miguel Ángel Rodríguez and Rafael Calderón Fernier, son of another president, were convicted of taking bribes, and both were given 5-year sentences. The Chinchilla government was also rocked by scandals among her ministers and principal advisors. The current president, Carlos Alvaro Quesada, elected in 2018, mostly as a result of a controversy over his opponent's opposition to same-sex marriage, has faced a different kind of scandal: the discovery in early 2020 of a centralized entity known as the Unidad Presidencial de Análisis de Datos, or Presidential Data Analysis Unit, that gave the president access to his country's citizens' data, supposedly so that the government could create better public policy, but which civil society saw as a threat to all of Costa Ricans' privacy. The president was then forced to close it down. As a result, his approval rating has been pretty low, ranging in the high 30s with only a brief spike because of his handling of COVID early on. Meanwhile, the economy has been hit hard as tourism and services have suffered from the virus and inequality is starting to grow. Costa Rica is quite right to be proud of what it has accomplished so far, but enormous challenges lay ahead.